I'll turn it over to John. Welcome, John Potter from NCII.
All right, thank you, Michelle. Well, welcome everyone. It's good to have some folks here. I know, again, after school is always a little bit of a tough time to show up to these things, but appreciate the opportunity to chat with you today. And as Michelle mentioned, this will be recorded, so if you want to go back to it or share it with folks, you can do that as well. So I'll just give some quick background, who I am, and then um, we'll do just like some quick introductions. So my name is John Potter. I work with the National Center on Intensive Intervention. I am physically located in Portland, Oregon, so just up the road, north of you all, many of you all. My background is in school psychology and special education. I've been with the National Center for 2 years now. Prior to that, I worked for 13 years in Oregon, was a statewide coach for RTI, MTSS around early literacy. So we worked with over 100 school districts across the state of Oregon, building multi-tiered systems for early literacy. So I do a lot of work with schools, districts, state departments around MTSS, systems change, early and early literacy, as well as secondary literacy. So we've worked with a number of middle schools and high schools as well. And then my really specialty is kind of assessment and decision making, which is what we'll talk about today when we kind of dive in with a little bit with progress monitoring. So as we kind of transition here to talk about some of the content, I would love for you all, if you just want to introduce yourselves in the chat, maybe just put your name in the chat and where your role and where you're from. So I'll give you a second to do that, and then we'll kind of get started. So, but we'd love to know where everyone's from. All right, welcome, Sandra. Welcome, Lauren. Hey, outside Modesto, Sacramento area, Layla, welcome. Ying, welcome from Fresno. Um, Lisette, welcome. All right. All right, Michelle from Albany. All right. Well, welcome everyone. Glad to have you here today. We're going to do kind of a little bit of content, but give you guys kind of opportunities to ask questions, to share. So please, if you do have questions, we will have time at the end, but you can also feel free to put them in the chat, or, a small enough group, if you want to come off mute and ask your question, you are welcome to do that as well. All right. So really, today our charge is we're going to talk about progress monitoring, but more specifically, we're going to talk about how to use progress monitoring data. So I know at the end we'll share some additional resources, and I did a session earlier in the year in, I believe, October, that was recorded. That's more on what progress monitoring is, so how to choose a tool and what that looks like. This one is going to be more around like how do we use that progress monitoring data. Right, because that's really the purpose of this all, is we don't just collect it for the sake of having data and putting it on a shelf or entering in a computer. Data is meant to change students' trajectories and change outcomes. So we want to use that progress monitoring data for instructional decision making. So we're going to talk about a couple things. We're going to talk about one, like when we graph the data, which is really essential for decision making, we need to graph progress monitoring data. We want to say, what are the features of a graph that we should look for? Many of you probably have like a database or a software system that graphs it for you, but we want to make sure that we've got all the pieces in there so we can make a really sound decision. So we'll talk about that. And then we'll also talk about the idea of using decision rules to interpret progress monitoring data. So how do we use data along with some decision rules to really figure out, like, when is it time to change an intervention, maybe continue an intervention, or what are our next steps? So how do we use that data? Right? So just to kind of orient us all around progress monitoring in general, this is our definition of what progress monitoring is. And I want you to just in the chat, if you would, just put in there like a word or a phrase that you find in there that kind of sticks out for you as being important when you think about progress monitoring. So I'll give you a second, just put a word or phrase that really sticks out for you. Yeah, ongoing. Yes, that's going to be an important piece of progress monitoring. Responsiveness. Yep, repeated measurement. Adjustments to the program. Yep, that's why we do it, so we can adjust what we're doing. Yeah, those are some of the key pieces that we think about. So yeah, so it is ongoing and repeated measurement. So this is measurement that we do over time to really figure out if we're making progress towards an important goal. So we think about the same thing as when we set a plan or a goal for ourselves. So we may set, for example, like an exercise plan where we may be tracking like, weight loss or performance. Maybe we want to run faster, we want to lift more weights, or we want to be able to walk longer. We want to track that over time, right? We want to know, are we getting closer to our goal? And we don't want to wait until the end of our plan or program to know if we got there. We want to know all along if we're making progress towards that. And so that's really what progress monitoring data is. And the best way that I heard progress monitoring described that resonated for me is I once heard someone say, progress monitoring data is the closest thing we have to a crystal ball in education. And I'll show kind of why we'd say that, what that looks like. But the idea is it can be fairly predictive of where we're heading. If we continue doing what we're doing, progress monitoring data tells us, where we're going to be in the future. And so all those all those phrases you put in the chat really resonate. Repeated measurement that allows us to really adjust programs on an ongoing basis to make sure we're doing what's going to be most effective and what works most effectively for our students. All right. So when we think about progress monitoring data, when we have a tool, we should be graphing that data in order to make those decisions. And in order to do that, the graph really needs to have some pretty consistent essential features. And so I'm going to show kind of what those are. And this may look something like the progress monitoring data that you're familiar with or your software system. If not, at the end, I'm going to share some tools from NCII that you can actually use to graph your own data if you would like, if you don't have something. But the idea is we have this graph, right? And on the y-axis here on the left here, we have basically the unit of measurement. So basically that's what we want students to gain skills in. And so for this particular graph, we're looking at words correct per minute. So we're looking at like an oral reading fluency measure where kids read a passage for 1 minute, and the more words that they can read accurately is an indicator of reading proficiency. And so as kids go up, we know that they're gaining more skills and are on track to be proficient readers. Along the x-axis here on the bottom, we have the date. So that's the time, right? So as we monitor progress, we want to see, that go up over time. Kids should be gaining words per minute or gaining letter sounds or gaining the ability to blend and segment words over time. They should be able to do more of that over time. So that's really what we're looking for. And so on these graphs, then you see some features that you'll have. And so the first is what we call a baseline. And that's really just like where we start. That's, when kids come in, you get the kids you get, and they have a starting place before they've had any instruction at all. And so we call that the baseline of where we're starting before we implement an intervention or an instructional program. So we want to know where we're starting. We also have progress monitoring data. So that's the data that we collect on a weekly basis, on a monthly basis, maybe it's every other week, but we chart that over time to know what does that student's performance look like over time. So it's not just a static beginning and end, but we want to see over time where students are headed. So we've got our baseline and we've got our progress monitoring points that we graph over time. So you can see is for this particular student, they're going up just a little bit over time. And so the next thing that's really important that I see sometimes is left off progress monitoring graphs is a goal. And so we know, for example, at the end of the school year, maybe we're looking at for this student, we want them to read, looks like, a little over 100 words correct per minute. So that's the goal that we're shooting for. And there's different ways to set goals. I'll share some resources that can help you with that. But we set a goal that's going to be an ambitious and attainable goal of where we want students to get to. And sometimes I see that left off. And if we leave off that goal, what we find is that we have kids, a graph like this, where we see, well, the kid's going up, they're gaining reading skills. But if you look at the goal line, which is really a straight line from the baseline to the goal, this is not a student who's on track to meet that goal. And so while they are improving and we want to celebrate that, this student is not improving at a rate that would put them on track to be a goal or to meet that important goal. And so all students really improve in reading over time. And so this student is improving, but we know other students are also improving. And so we want those students who are starting at a lower reading level or a lower level of skill to catch up through interventions. And so we want to be able to track that over time. And so we have a goal line and a goal, which really tells us, what's the straightest path from A to B. Not to say kids are going to grow on this straight line path. Those of you that have administered progress monitoring data over time, kids have good days, kids have bad days. They go up, they go down, sometimes a lot. But we want to stay on this general path of like, are we staying on this goal line? And I'll talk about some decision rules that we can use to evaluate that. One thing that you may see, some data systems will calculate what's called a trend line for you, which is basically just a fancy statistical analysis that the software does to really just forecast out on a straight line. If we continue on this path of data, this is where we will end up at the end of the year. And so for this particular student, we could see, again, that crystal ball tells us that student is not going to reach that goal. And so if we want a student to reach that goal, we need to change something in our practice, because right now the trajectory is not conducive to that student meeting that goal. Trend lines are nice to have. They are not essential necessarily. I say, and we'll talk about some decision rules that have trend lines. If your system calculates it, that's great. If it doesn't, don't worry about it. There's other ways to look at your data, but it is kind of nice to have a trend line if you do. But again, not essential. We also have these vertical lines that we want to put in, and I see these left out sometimes too. These are called phase lines. And these are really what we want to note on our graph whenever it is that we make a significant change. Because we want to know, as a result of changing X, whatever it is, what impact did it have on student growth and the student trajectory. And so, for example, if we make a change here to the student's intervention plan, and we find the data now looks like this, we want to celebrate whatever we did at that phase line. It worked. It put that student on a much higher trajectory. We can celebrate that. We could also bank that as a strategy that works. So when we have similar students, we can try something like that. But if we don't have a phase line in there, sometimes you'll go back and you'll see these random upward trajectories, or a student will sometimes drop off, and we don't really know why that is. And so we want to better understand what it is that we do that impacts students when we decide to make a change. And when I say make a change, that means like maybe we change the curriculum, maybe we move them to a different group, maybe we add time, maybe we add a behavior plan. There's a whole host of things you could do, but we want to note that we did something different so we can say, yes, like that worked, or maybe that didn't work, and we don't want to do that again. And so these are really the critical essential features that you want to have on all your progress monitoring graphs. Again, your system should do this for you, but if not, you may need to think about like how we can get these things input into your progress monitoring graph. The one that's not absolutely essential is the trend line, because that's something that some systems do it, some systems don't. Nice to have, but not necessarily essential piece. Right? And so then the question we get asked a lot is that goal, like how do we set that goal? And there's not like a right or wrong answer to like, this is a right goal, this is a wrong goal. But how I like to think about the goals is that they should meet two general criteria. Is one, they should be ambitious. They should be goals that are high goals that set the student up on a trajectory to be successful. Now, some students are starting from a much lower place, so that goal may not be like getting to the benchmark this year. But the question is, does that goal catch them up? Maybe they're going to take a couple of years for that student to catch up to benchmark. Maybe it's going to take 3. Maybe your students with the most significant needs are going to take some time to get caught up. But the question is, does it work towards an educationally meaningful outcome, and does it catch the student up? And so we want to be able to have a defensible goal that sets us on a trajectory to do that. Alternatively, we also want it to be attainable. I don't want to set a goal for a kid that's impossible or that has never been achieved. For example, if we've got a student who comes in with, no reading behavior, can't read a single word, and we're expecting by the end of the year they're going to read like 120 words on a 5th grade level, that may not be possible. So I don't want to set up a student and a teacher for failure. And so we want something that's attainable. I'll talk about some ways to do that. But the idea is we want to at least have a defensible approach and say, I set this goal because it is ambitious and this is why. It is also attainable and this is why. And so we have we have some resources. These are all linked in the presentation and on the handout. But NCII has a resource for setting goals. Typically, there's 3 ways that folks do that. One is to set it at the benchmark. So for many of your students who are just need a little bit of catch up, saying at the benchmark at the end of the year is a very good goal. The second goal setting method is around rates of improvement. So that just looks at, on average, how much does a typical student grow over time? And so looking at that growth rate to say, if average students grow around this, we want our students to grow around that or more over time. And then the last one, intra-individual framework, is more individualized for students with the most intensive needs, which is really just a way to calculate and say, we've got students who are significantly behind, they're not making much growth. Let's just try to accelerate the growth that they're making. So maybe you got a student who's, growing, a half word a week. Like, let's just try and get a word a week growth out of that student. So we want to measure their growth against their own growth and try to accelerate that. So a good resource for you to kind of dive into more depth and take a look at that. But in general, once we have a goal, once we have a graph, the question then is, how do we interpret that and how do we figure out what are our next steps? And there's three general scenarios that happen when you set up that data. The first one is something like this, where we see that the data is consistently below the line. And so these dots aren't connected, but that doesn't matter. Some graphs connect them, some don't. But over time, this student is not growing at a rate that's above that goal line. And so we know when data are consistently below the goal line, we need to make a change because this student is not on track to meet their goal. If we keep doing what we're doing, again, that crystal ball says we're not going to get to that goal. So we need to make a change. So that's a pretty easy decision to make. Alternatively, another relatively easy decision to make is if a student is consistently above the goal line, great. What you're doing is working. Let's continue doing what you're doing because that crystal ball says that we are going to be on track and meet or exceed our goal by the end of the year. Now, if we've got a little bit of a lower goal that's maybe below the benchmark, I may choose to raise that goal because the student is on track to meet this goal. But if we've got them on track to meet grade level expectation by the end of the year, like let's keep doing what we're doing because it's working. Let's not take away what we're doing because they haven't got there yet, but let's keep doing what we're doing and we should be getting where we want to go by the end of the year. So that's also an easy decision, right? All below the line, we need to make a change. All above the line, things are great. It's this one that gets a little bit tricky, right? Where you have both above and below, where you're bouncing up and down around that line. And when that happens, really, that's where we want to try and use some decision rules to help get a little bit more consistent with the decisions that we're making. Because the question is, like, how long are we going to, wait for points below the line before we make a change? Or how long do we have enough points above the line before we feel good, really good about where kids are at and on track? So we want to have some decision rules that guide that. And so here's how I think about decision rules, and I'm going to share some examples of what those look like. Is that these decision rules provide an if-then guide for our decision making. And so it's a really way for teams to get together and say, if we see this pattern, then we are going to respond by doing this. So it's going to increase clarity for staff and students. So we know that, we don't have to kind of, think too deeply about the decision that we're making, but it's real clear that we made a change because we saw this. It's also very clear for parents when they say, well, why did you make a change in my student's intervention plan? It's because we have a decision rule and we're not going to let a student stay below that line for X amount of time. It's also going to increase consistency across schools, classrooms, and students. And so if you work in across schools or in a district with multiple schools, or even in a school with multiple teachers and grade levels and teams, we all know people can make very different decisions. And so we don't want kids to have to win the educational lottery to where if they go to this grade level or this school, like they're going to get this decision versus this grade level or this school, same kid, very different decision. And so we want some consistency in decision making. If we see this data, we respond in this way. But it's very important to understand that the data do not make the decisions, we make the decision. So when I say decision rules, they're not like these automated algorithms where whenever we see this, 100% of the time we do this. They're really guides to help us think about, a great phrase I used to hear when we use decision rules is decision rules cause us to pause, analyze, and respond. So if we see this pattern, we need to stop. We need to talk about what that means, and we need to respond in this particular way. And so, again, they help us make decisions, but we still use that data to make decisions. We still use our professional judgment within that data as well. All right. So what are we talking about with decision rules? Here's three typical ones I see used. I'm going to have you guys play through a couple of these and kind of think through what they might mean. Um, but again, this is another handout, and all the links will be in the PowerPoint and in the handout. But this is the three decision rules we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about the 4-point rule, a trend line rule, and the median data point rule. I'm going to walk through a couple of these, the simpler ones. And if you want to dive into more depth and see what the other one looks like, you're welcome to look at this handout as well. And so here's the 4-point decision rule. This is the easiest one to use, I think. It's not necessarily the most reliable or accurate one. Now, that's not to say it's inaccurate. It's just others are a little bit better, but this one is, still good. It's like, would I like to have 3 scoops of ice cream or one? It's like both would be great, but 3 scoops might be better. But I'm not going to turn down 1 scoop. Um, so for the 4-point rule, you want to collect at least 3 weeks of data and at least 6 data points. And so I think the piece to really key on there is not necessarily the 3 weeks, but the 6 data points. Now you're thinking, if you're doing the math, like if I only collect data once a week, that's going to be 6 weeks of data collection. And in general, I wouldn't make any big decisions about kids, about changing instructional intervention plans until about 6 to 8 weeks. I would want to let those intervention plans run before I think about like moving them to a different intervention, changing group size, changing time. Now, that's not to say like you shouldn't be making instructional moves every day, right? Like if I see things aren't working, like I want to tweak my instructional delivery every single day, but I don't want to make like wholesale changes to the intervention until about 6 to 8 weeks. But for this one, really, you're just looking at the last 4 data points. And so what we're going to do is if we find that all 4 data points are above the goal line, for example, in this example here, we want to consider increasing the goal if it's below the benchmark, because this student right here is killing it and the interventionist is killing it. They're doing a great job there. But in general, we want to continue that intervention. Like if all the last 4 data points are above the line, they're on track, they're doing great, keep doing what you're doing. Conversely, if all 4 of the last data points are below the line, that's when we want to consider adapting and changing that intervention because it's not working. Now, this is where like professional judgment comes into play, and we don't just automatically like do things based on the decision rule. Because if I have 4 points below this line, but all 4 points are like right below the line, like right on the line, I may look at other data and say, maybe my other data says they're doing great. They're doing great in core instruction. They're passing all the intervention checkouts. Like I may choose to continue that because they're right on that line. But in general, if you got 4 points below that line, significantly below that line, you need to make a change. And then the last one is if 4 points are both above and below, so that, that bounce there where some are good, some are below, things are working. Like keep doing what you're doing. Because again, that goal line is the path that we want kids to travel to get to that goal. And if they're both above and below it, great. Like that's where we expect them to be based on our intervention. So we would continue doing what we're doing. All right. So I'm gonna give you guys a little practice here with this. So a couple of sample kids. So just in the chat here, so we've got our 4-point decision rule here. So just put a 1, 2, or 3 in the chat there. So put a 1 if all the points are above the goal line, a 2 if all of them are below the goal line. Remember, just the last 4, and 3 if both the last 4 points are both above and below the goal line. Yeah, so everyone's got 2 there. Yeah, pretty obvious on that one. All 4 of the last points are below the goal line. So should we continue or adapt the intervention? So you can put in a C or an A. Should we continue that intervention or should we adapt it? Yeah, adapt it. Yep. Yeah. This kid's not on track. We want to adapt the intervention. Yeah. Easy one. All right. So next one, same question. 1 if they're all above the goal line, the last 4. 2 if they're all below, a 3 if they're both above and below. Yep. Yeah. So we got above and below for this one. So for this student, again, C or A, should we continue this intervention? Should we adapt it? Yep. So this one we would continue because they're on that line, they're on track. Let's keep doing what we're doing. Yep. Exactly. Yeah. So the 4-point rule, simple, easy, straightforward, real quick. Again, not the most accurate. The other ones are a little bit more accurate, But again, like still a good one, a great place to start, an easy one that you can train a lot of people to do. I would recommend, like if you don't have decision rules, that may be where you want to start. Next one I want to go over real quickly, and then we'll do another activity, is thinking about the trend line analysis. So again, like you may have a system that has a trend line, you may not, but if you do, this is a good rule to use. So this one, 4 weeks of instruction, at least 8 data points. Again, like if you're only collecting data once a week, you're going to need to wait at least 8 weeks before you want to do this. Whereas with the 4-point rule, really all you need is 4 points to make a decision. The trend line analysis, to have a really stable trend line, you need at least like 8 to 10 data points. Because if you only have a few data points, that trend line is going to be really thrown out of whack. If kids have like one high score, one low score, there's a lot of outliers, it can really change pretty rapidly. So we want to make sure to collect more data if we're looking at trend line analysis. But in general, the trend line, it's going to draw, again, just like a line that's going to show like where a kid's headed based on the data. And so if we find that the student's trend line is steeper than the goal line, that's where we would say the kid is on track and we can consider increasing that goal if it's below the benchmark. But in general, we want to continue that intervention because this crystal ball has told me this kid's going to way exceed their goal. So this intervention is working really effectively. Conversely, if the student's trend line is flatter than the goal line, that's where we want to consider adapting the intervention. I might also look at fidelity in this point because maybe we're not even able to do the intervention with fidelity. So before we make any changes, let's see, are we actually doing what we said we're doing? But this kid is not on track, so we would want to change. And if the student's trend line and goal line are the same or roughly the same, but in general that they're headed in the same direction, then we want to continue because again, that goal line is generally where we want to be. We want to be on this trajectory to hit that goal. So we could continue to monitor progress, collect more data, but just continue doing what we're doing. Right? Let's do a little practice with this one too. So same kind of question. So with this one, is the trend line steeper, flatter, or the same? So you could put maybe ST, F, or SA. Yeah, so this one is, yeah, I'm assuming people, the S is for steeper. Yeah, this one is steeper. Should we continue or adapt this intervention? What should we do with this one? C or A? Yeah, continue. Yeah, this one we want to continue. Again, crystal ball tells us we're doing good. Let's keep doing what we're doing. All right, how about this one? So is this one steeper, flatter, or the same as the goal line? Yeah, so some Fs there. Yeah, this one is flatter. So really easy to see that this student is not on track to hit that goal. We need to make a change to that intervention. So we continue or adapt that intervention. I kind of already shared that. Yeah. So this one, we would want to adapt that intervention. Again, assuming this is an appropriate goal. Like if this were a case where this goal was not appropriate and no kid has ever achieved this goal with where this kid has started, maybe we want to rethink how we set that goal. But if it's an appropriate goal, yes, this student is not on track to hit that. So we would want to think about making a change for this student. Yeah. All right. So when we think about data and progress monitoring, I'm going to say graphing is really essential to what we do. And here's the example of how I share that. And I've sat at some meetings, not necessarily all meetings, but I've sat at meetings where we look at students in interventions and we look at the progress monitoring data and we're trying to make a decision, what should we do next? And I get something like this, where it's an Excel file. It's just put in a Word document, but I see just raw data over time that this student started at 32 words per minute. The goal is for them to be at 87 by the end of the year, and this is their data. So we're just every week that we collect data, we just put it in this little spreadsheet here so we can see where kids are headed. And so give me a yes, a no, or maybe an I don't know. Is this student on track to reach their goal? Is this progress adequate for this student? So maybe a Y, a no, or a maybe, yeah, I don't know. Yeah, so we got a Y, we got no, no, we got no, I don't know, no, I don't know, maybe. Yeah, yeah, I'm in the same boat as you all, like, I don't know. Um, Yeah, no, 87 is too high. Yeah, it doesn't look like it, right? Like they don't think they're going to get there. So it's a hard decision to make. So if we graph it though, now tell me, yes, no, or I don't know. Is this student on track to hit their goal? Yeah. Yep. Yeah, all their points are below above the aim line. You use any decision rule, and you're going to easily clearly see that this student is on track to meet their goal. Whoops. But if you look at that raw data, right, like it's, I don't know, or those of you said no, I might agree with you. Like it just doesn't look like it. And so this is why graphing data is really important because it's really easy. You all could see within like a couple seconds of looking at that graph after understanding, about graph and decision rules, like the kids are on track. This kid is on track. And so this is why we need to have a graph with all those components on it. Because even if I ask you that question, if there was no goal or goal line, like I bet there would be disagreement as if that kid is on track or not on track, because it depends on what how you quantify success for this kid. And so, but we have a clear goal, we have a clear goal line, and we have some data to show where we want to be. And so graphing is really essential to do that. If you don't have a program that does it, you can do it in Excel. Again, I'll share a resource at the end through NCII that allows you to graph your data, but it's going to be really important to graph your data and have all those features as a part of it. Right? All right. So that's kind of all content, but I want to kind of get into a little bit of kind of next steps for you all and hear kind of where you guys are at. And so, Michelle, do we want to do breakout rooms? Can we do like a couple maybe?
Yeah, maybe we could have breakout rooms and then could we have an independent option for those? I know there's
Sure.
some of you traveling at the moment. So
Yeah. 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 So, and uh, Michelle, if you want to put the link to the slides again in there, so you all can kind of access this while you go to the breakout rooms. But if you set up some breakout rooms, if you want to do independently, you can do that as well. But I want you to just kind of reflect on this, and I'll kind of walk through this a little bit. Reflect on this flow chart to see like what is your next step for you or your school or your district. Where do you kind of need to tap in? And so the idea is you start up at the top, and the very first step is really like we have to have a progress monitoring tool and we have to collect the data. And so the question is, are you collecting it or is someone at your school collecting and graphing that progress monitoring data? Because I see again, some people collect it, but they don't graph it. So if you're not graphing it or collecting it or someone isn't, your next step is really to get a progress monitoring measure and then collect and graph that data. If you are collecting and graphing that, then you go down to the next step here that asks, do your graphs have all those essential features? Do you have baselines? Do you have progress monitoring data points? Is there a goal line? If available, is there a trend line? Do you make phase line changes when you make a change? If no, your next step is really making sure that those progress monitoring graphs have all those features embedded in them, because again, that's going to allow you to make those decisions. Once you have those, or if you have those now, then you go down to this next step and you can say, do you use one of the following decision rules to interpret data and determine next steps? So I shared the 4-point rule, the trend line rule. I didn't talk about the median rule, but that's on the handout as well as another option. But if you have data, it's graph, you have all those features, the next step is, do we use decision rules to guide our decision making around those? If no, then you want to choose a decision rule. Maybe you're going to start with the 4-point rule because that's the most straightforward and easy one, and begin applying it with the students that you work with. If you do, once you do that, or if you're already doing that, your next step I find is really about consistency, is really making sure that people are using those decision rules consistently across staff. So if you're in a leadership position, it's about like making sure like getting everyone on the same page. Maybe you're a teacher or a reading interventionist. It's about how do we talk with our team about getting some consistent decision rules implemented across our school. And so it's really about implementing something consistently and then revising as needed. No decision rule is perfect. Some are going to work better depending on the context. And so just like, we implement interventions and we progress monitor and we make changes to student plans over time, the things that we do as educators, we need to be monitoring how we're doing with those things. If your decision rules aren't working and you're finding that, kids look like they're on track, but they're not on track and we're not making changes when we need to, have a conversation about your decision rules. Maybe you need to change them. Maybe you need to let kids go a little further before we make a change. Maybe we need to make a change a little quicker. So there's some options for that. So next steps, just want you to, again, like if you're driving or you're independent, you can kind of reflect on like where do you see your school or your practice being at. If you want to be in a breakout room, we can put you in a breakout room and you can have conversations with some folks and share and hear a little bit more where other people are at, and see what their next steps are and where the breakdowns are occurring. All right. All right, Michelle, can we get some breakout rooms? How long do we want to put folks in breakout rooms for?
That's what I was just asking you before I
Yeah,
unmuted. Like 5 minutes?
I think 5 minutes is good.
Okay.
Just kind of explore where people are at, and then we'll come back as a whole group and we'll kind of talk and hopefully have some people just share out like where you're seeing strengths and areas of need for your staff or your practice. So
Okay.
great.
So we'll have two open. Those of you who just want to reflect independently can stay in the main room. And if you need help getting to a breakout room, just holler. We can get you put in a room. So you can self-select either room 1 or 2 if you'd like to chat with other people.
Room one seems popular.
Hi, this is
Hello.
Sandra. Hello.
Yeah. Hi, Sandra.
I use Dibbles,
Hmm.
and we do have certain features like they set goals and you're tracking and it tells you whether you're not but I really like that graph. I'm an interventionist, so sometimes I want to show the teachers like show students like this is the growth, or for like their SSPTs, that would be a great visual. So you guys are going to share that, or is that part of the slides?
Yeah, it's part of the slides. Yeah, and there'll be links in there to all the other
Okay.
resources they need. Yeah. And that's I didn't mention this, but that's another like really key feature of why we want to like graph the progress monitoring data is communication, right? Not just for other teachers, but for parents as well. Like it's
Yeah.
really easy understandable to say like this is the growth that we want your student to be on. They're above that line, they're below that line, rather than like, I mean, I get reports from my student school sometimes, it's just a bunch of numbers, and I have no context for like if that's good, if that's bad. I don't know where the goal is. Like, it's hard to
Now,
understand.
I noticed you said that you guys collect data every week. We do every 2 weeks. So
Okay.
we teach 2 weeks and then we collect the data. And then 2 weeks collect the data. And it's like a PDSA, 6 week cycle or 8 week cycle. Um, yeah. So,
Yeah. Yeah, and I think honestly, like if you're collecting data every other week, I think like 8 weeks is probably a sweet spot for like starting to make a decision. I mean, you could wait and get another data point if things are looking a little like iffy, maybe you're unclear. And what you could also do as well, like if you come to that like 8 weeks and maybe say like you've got 3 points below the line and you're not really sure, just collect another data point. Like at that last week, you could do a couple probes. Like they're only a minute. Like you could grab 2 data points and then graph both of them to see where kids are at.
and we've had a discussion, unfortunately, not unfortunately, but we're doing CKLA.
Hmm.
And we noticed the difference between DIBBLES, like the progress monitoring, do not correlate with what the teacher's teaching at that moment.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like do you not teach to the test, but do you look at the patterns in the test? And then, that's, I guess, the teacher's frustrations. I grab the sight words from there and I do orthographic mapping with that. But the teachers, they're in the class, they have a certain amount of time and they're like, well, like all these patterns, my kids are doing CVC and then now they're testing them on variable vowels. And I'm like, so that's why it's like this, So
Yeah. Eh, Yeah, and in general, if you're using Dibbles, like, and most progress monitoring measures are like this, but Dibbles does one of the better jobs, I think, at this is all those probes are designed to be about the same level of difficulty. Now, they're not going to be exactly the same because there's things you just can't control for. Like if you get a kid who loves horses and the stories about horses, like they're going to do
they're
better
gonna
on
know
it.
more. Yeah,
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 like that's just, you can't control for that. But in general, all of the probes are designed to be about the end of the year level difficulty. So what a kid at the end of the year should be able to do. So as you teach like CVC, R controlled vowels, kids are gaining skills and like
yeah,
incrementally climbing that ladder. So it won't like map on exactly, but like you should see like as they build those skills, they should get higher and higher towards that goal.
yeah. Because we were looking at 4 assessments because we're doing the PDSA, and they had us start on progress monitoring 10, and we noticed 10 and 11 easy. 12 and 13, we were like, oh my God, they have words with like irregular vowels that you teach, and it's second grade, and you're like, but it's like, we're gonna have to figure out a way, like,
Yeah.
so, it's
And
just a little frustrating.
yeah, and I was just in another district a couple weeks ago and talking about this. Like every teacher knows like the passage, like the hard passage, because like all your kids do worse on that,
Yeah,
or the easy
yeah.
passage. And they've tried to do better on that. I remember like the old Dibbles, and I'm from Oregon. The old Dibbles had a passage about Keiko the killer whale. And like Keiko, like is from Oregon, like it was in Oregon. Oregon kids killed that passage because they knew
But
who
not
Keiko
anybody
was,
else.
not anybody else. So they got rid of it, thankfully. But the idea is like in general, like they're all going to be similar, but like you'll see some patterns where some kids are just all kids are going to do worse on some, all kids are going to do better on some. But you should see like fluctuations of like 5, 10, 15 words, maybe passage to passage. Shouldn't be seeing much more than that. Otherwise, there's something else going on. So
Yeah,
yeah.
okay.
We
Right.
looks like everyone's back from the breakout room.
All
Okay.
right. Well, welcome back, everyone. Would love to hear just from a couple people if you guys want to share out maybe like where are you finding yourself on this flow chart? Like where's your next step? What do you feel like you've got going really well? And then what's something that resonated as like a next step for you to take your progress monitoring practices kind of to the next level? So you can feel free to put it in the chat or just hop off mute. That's great too. Would love to kind of hear where people are at.
Hi, so Jasmine Posey, Reef Sunset in Central Valley, California. In our group, we all pretty much, in some form or another, collect data using various tools, but we do not consistently plot and graph that data. So pretty unanimously, we decided that that was our next step, taking our data and actually graphing it so we can see the data more clearly.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one thing I didn't mention in the presentation, but we talked about folks who stayed in this room is the other benefit of graphing is also it's great communication with other teachers, but also with parents and families. Because it's really easy to clearly see like here's the goal, here's where kids need to be. Think of it, it's like your GPS, like we want to be on this track. We don't want to get too far below this track, too far above the track. Great, like you're doing well, like think about like we're ahead of time, like we're making great time, we're going to get there way early, like you don't want to be way late. But that's a really easy way to communicate with parents. I have little kids. I have a first grader who I get like data from school that it's not a graph, it's just raw data. I have no idea, like it's numbers, is this good or is this bad, like. And I think sometimes the schools like not purposely, but we just send things to parents or communicate to parents in ways that's not really clear. So if you can have a graph with a goal line, that's you don't have to explain that too deeply to parents. Like they can get the gist of it pretty quickly and easily. And they also understand, like, if we have to make a change, like, this is why, because students are below the goal line. Like, think about, again, the GPS analogy. Like, I've used that with parents a lot. Like, this student's going to be late. Like, we got to get them more on time. We gotta change the practice. And it's not because of anything like inherently wrong with the student, right? Like, it's what we are doing is not working. And so I talked about like evaluating progress monitoring in the way that we're like evaluating a student's response to the intervention that we're delivering. But progress monitoring data is as much or more an evaluation of what we are doing. It's an evaluation of our practices to say, is this working for this particular student? Not because it's good or bad. Like, sometimes kids just need something different, but we want to have something that helps us evaluate our practices so we can make a change where we need to make a change. Okay. Anyone else want to share? You could share like where you're at on this or anything else, any ahas or things that popped up for folks. Or if you have a question, you can feel free to hop in and ask a question as well.
This is a question that's definitely outside the scope of this webinar, but there's that thing right there that you just said. Like, if what we're doing isn't currently working, do we have other ideas of what to try next? But that's not about necessarily this webinar.
Yeah.
Not always so clear what to do next. You know?
Yeah. Let me see. Yeah, I could share towards the end. National Center Intensive Intervention has some resources on kind of like different things that you can change. And I find it's helpful to like create like a list or a menu for teachers of like, here's the things that we want to generally start with. And generally there's things like time, like you can give more time to students. That could be like a double dose of instruction. That could be adding 15 minutes. We also want to think about, you could change the group size. Like if you got a group of 6 and you decrease the amount of kids in that group, kids are going to get more individual attention. So if you can do that, that's helpful. One thing I find that works pretty well, which is a nice first step, is we talk about opportunities to respond, which is just really a fancy way of saying like give students more turns to practice words. And so the more like opportunities kids get to practice skills, the better they become at something. And really that's anyone, right? Like that's how we learn anything. It's practice. Like we practice it, and if we do it incorrectly, we get feedback, and then we do it again and we get feedback. Like that's the cycle of learning. So like maybe you can't get more time in your day, but can we give kids more opportunities to respond within the time we have? Can we speed that up a little bit? Not like that we're rushing through it, but can we give kids practice? I used to, when I was teaching reading interventions, like I took data on the errors the kids made, like, and then at the end of the class, like for the last 5 minutes, we went back and we practiced all those errors again, just so I make sure like they got more repetitions with that. So you can change time, you can change group size. Some kids need like a motivation plan or a behavior plan that you could build in. You can do that. But yeah, I'll share some resources at the end for NCII. They have a whole list of like different things that you can kind of adapt and change. The other thing I'll say too, because I know many of you are like interventionists, sometimes when you look at that data, and this is a hard one for, I think, like schools in general to think about, but like that data is not just an evaluation of what the interventionist is doing or what is happening in the intervention. It's an evaluation of everything the student is getting. Because I've definitely seen it's where like that 30 minutes of intervention they get, it's like high opportunities to respond, explicit instruction, good feedback, like it looks really great. But then kids don't take what they learned in that session back to their classroom. It's like, well, we just taught you this routine for decoding multisyllabic words. You get back in your class, you hit a multisyllabic word, and you just fall apart. And so it's like, how can we support kids to use those strategies across the day? Or do our core instruction teachers, do they know like what the routines are that kids are learning so they can help them use those strategies when they get into the classroom? I'll use the example like for multisyllabic words. One of the, like, especially in middle schools, one of the effective practices is teaching kids a routine to decode multisyllabic words. I was working on a project where we were doing that, and we created just a bookmark with like 4 easy steps of here's how to decode a multisyllabic word. And it's like circle the prefix, circle the suffix, underline each syllable, sound it out. Like it's like 3 or 4 steps. We wrote that down, put it graphically on a bookmark. Kids took that bookmark to their other classes, and they were able to take it out when they came to a multisyllabic word, so they could remember what the strategy was to do that. Like, so teachers didn't have to like necessarily do too much. They just reminded kids to use the strategy that they had learned. So things like that, like, don't put the onus all on the interventionists. Like, we also want to know, like, everyone needs to help. It's not just about that 30 minutes a day. It's about what kids are getting throughout the day. I mean, that 30 minutes intervention or 45 should be pretty solid. But sometimes kids don't do well because they don't transfer what they learned in intervention across settings. So it may be that you need to change and do some planning around that with other teachers, which I know can be challenging because it's about communication. So
Still though, that's a really good place where we might not be putting a lot of thought,
yeah. I mean, I find when you think about like intervention changes, at least like the first intervention change, as much as possible, make it simple stuff like change time, change group size, like really quick, easy things that you can do. The more complex you make it, the more likely it's probably not going to happen with fidelity. That's a good question. So, yeah. Other questions from folks? Or just want to share out where folks are at on this? Maybe I'll ask, is anyone at a different point where like you're graphing the data and maybe you're not using decision rules? Or is everyone so tired at the end of the day? Which is okay too. All right. Well, I won't keep you here any longer than we need to. So just a couple more things to kind of hit here. So here are some resources that we have. So these are all the things that I shared. So depending on where you're at in that flow chart, here's some resources. So if you need to identify a progress monitoring tool, you don't have something yet, NCII has an academic progress monitoring tools chart that looks at available resources and evaluates the research behind them. I will say, just with a caveat, this tools chart, all of the NCII tools charts, because we have one for intervention programs as well, it is not an endorsement of any program or tool that's on the list. What happens is publishers send NCII information on the research, the independent research that's collected on it. And NCII has an independent review board that looks at that research and evaluates the research. But it will tell you like if a tool is reliable, if it's valid, how long it takes to deliver. So it'll give you some information on that you can help evaluate like a tool on your own. So it's a good place to start if you need a tool. If you're not at a place where if you're at a place where you have a tool but you're not graphing it yet, first I would always start with your database. Like for example, someone mentioned using Dibbles. Dibbles has like they graph their own data. Like always use what is included in your with your tool first. If you don't have something, NCII has a Excel document that you can download and plug in your data, and it will graph for you. But also we have that handout that talks about the overview of goal setting strategies. So if you need some help with how to set goals, we have that resource as well. And then we have, if you graphed your data, you've got all the features in there and you just need to think about decision rules, we've got another document that can help guide you through like what are the options for decision rules. But again, like if you are just using decision rules for the first time, I would start with using the 4-point decision rule. If you have trend lines being calculated for you, I think that's a good starting place too. The third one is a really good decision rule, but it takes a little bit more to kind of understand it. Maybe not the place that you want to start with their decision rules. So, all right. So I'll give it over to Michelle to kind of talk about other opportunities.
Thanks, John. Thank you so much. Really great conversation with this group about just kind of next steps with progress monitoring. So exciting to see, especially the graphing ahas, you know, so much easier to when you see it right in front of you to really analyze that data. So we are wrapping up our Project Arise offerings for this year, but we do actually have our last community of practice, which is on intensive intervention, and it's this Thursday. And so if you would like to register for that, you can do so at the link I just put in the chat. We're going to go more into that, like, okay, how do you change the intervention? So what John just said in about 5 minutes, we'll stretch out into and show you the tools that you can use to do that. So if you're interested in joining, you can go ahead and register. On the next slide, you'll see we also have a feedback survey. If you could please take just a moment. I'm going to put it in the chat too, but this survey has 3 questions just to give us some feedback on the workshop and how it resonated with you today. Register. Yes. So Erica, great question. In the follow-up from John's presentation today, she asked if we if you can have access to recordings and slides from previous meetings. The answer is yes. When we send out the follow-up from this workshop today, you're going to see it has links from all of the NCII workshops that John has done with us prior in the past 2 years. So if you need to catch up, if you want to binge watch over the weekend, you'll have that opportunity. The links are all on YouTube as well. All right. And then speaking of follow-up, on that next slide, you'll see we have, we'll be sending out this follow-up document, and down here at the bottom, you see NCII's previous workshops. That's where you'll be able to access those. Also, if you'd like a certificate of participation for your time spent in this workshop today, go ahead and put your first name, last name, and email address in the chat. And just so you know, those of you, I know I recognize some names because you've been at all of our workshops. And Michelle, I have been very slow in getting the workshop certificates out. So I promise I'll get those to you by the end of the week for all the workshops that you've attended this month and last month. So first name, last name, email in the chat if you would like a certificate of completion. And then that's it. You can follow us on social media. If you would like to stay on and ask John some questions, we'll stay on the line for a little longer. But if not, we so appreciate your time today. Thanks again to John, and we hope that you have a great rest of your week, everyone, and get some rest on this spring forward.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.